Omar Hassan Ahmed al-Bashir, born January 1, 1944, is a Sudanese former military officer and politician who served as Sudan's head of state under various titles from 1989 until 2019, when he was deposed in a coup d'état. He was subsequently incarcerated, tried, and convicted on multiple corruption charges. He came to power in 1989 when, as a brigadier general in the Sudanese army, he led a group of officers in a military coup that ousted the democratically elected government of Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi after it began negotiations with rebels in the south. He subsequently replaced President Ahmed al-Merghani as head of state. He was elected 3 times as president in elections that have been under scrutiny for electoral fraud. In 1992, al-Bashir founded the National Congress Party, which remained the dominant political party in the country until 2019. In March 2009, al-Bashir became the first sitting head of state to be indicted by the International Criminal Court, ICC, for allegedly directing a campaign of mass killing, rape, and pillage against civilians in Darfur. On February 11, 2020, the government of Sudan announced that it had agreed to hand over al-Bashir to the ICC for trial. In October 2005, al-Bashir's government negotiated an end to the Second Sudanese Civil War, leading to a referendum in the south, resulting in the separation of the south as the country of South Sudan. In the Darfur region, he oversaw the war in Darfur that resulted in death tolls of around 10,000 according to the Sudanese government, but most sources suggest between 200,000 and 400,000. During his presidency, there were several violent struggles between the Janjaweed militia and rebel groups such as the Sudanese Liberation Army, SLA, and the Justice and Equality Movement, JEM, in the form of guerrilla warfare in the Darfur region. The civil war displaced over 2.5 million people out of a total population of 6.2 million in Darfur and created a crisis in the diplomatic relations between Sudan and Chad. The rebels in Darfur lost the support from Libya after the death of Muammar Gaddafi and the collapse of his regime in 2011. In July 2008, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, ICC, Luis Moreno Ocampo, accused al-Bashir of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes in Darfur. The court issued an arrest warrant for al-Bashir on March 4, 2009 on counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity, but ruled that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute him for genocide. However, on July 12, 2010, the court issued a second warrant containing 3 separate counts of genocide. The new warrant, like the first, was delivered to the Sudanese government, which did not recognize either the warrant or the ICC. The indictments do not allege that Bashir personally took part in such activities. Instead, they say that he is suspected of being criminally responsible, as an indirect co-perpetrator. The court's decision was opposed by the African Union, Arab League, and non-aligned movement as well as the governments of Libya, Somalia, Jordan, Turkey, Egypt, South Sudan, Djibouti, Eritrea, Pakistan, Algeria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, Palestine, Ethiopia, Tunisia, Morocco, Lebanon, Bahrain, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. From December 2018 onwards, al-Bashir faced large-scale protests which demanded his removal from power. On April 11, 2019, Bashir was ousted in a military coup d'état. In September 2019, Bashir was replaced by the Transitionary Military Council, which transferred executive power to a mixed civilian, military sovereignty council and a civilian prime minister, Abdallah Hamdok. 2 months later, the Forces of Freedom and Change Alliance, which holds indirect political power during the 39-month Sudanese transition to democracy, Hamdok and Sovereignty Council member Sadiq Talr stated that Bashir would be eventually transferred to the ICC. He was convicted of corruption in December of that year and sentenced to 2 years in prison. His trial regarding his role in the coup that brought him into power started on July 21, 2020. Al-Bashir was born on January 1, 1944 in Housh Banga, a village on the outskirts of Shendi, just north of the capital, Khartoum, to a family that hails from the Ja'alan tribe of northern Sudan. His mother was Hedi Mohammed Al-Zain, who died in 2019. His father, Hassan ibn Ahmed, was a small-time dairy farmer. He is the second among 12 brothers and sisters. His younger brother Uthman was killed in South Sudan during his presidency. His uncle, Al-Taib Mustafa, was a journalist, politician, and noted opponent of South Sudan. As a boy, he was nicknamed Omaira, Little Omar. He belongs to the Banu Badaria, a Bedouin tribe belonging to the larger Ja'alan coalition, a Sudanese Arab tribe in middle north of Sudan, once a part of the Kingdom of Egypt and Sudan. As a child, al-Bashir loved football. Always in defense, a cousin of Omar's said. That's why he went into the army. He received his primary education there, and his family later moved to Khartoum North where he completed his secondary education and became a supporter of al-Hilal. Al-Bashir is married to his cousin Fatima Khalid. He also has a second wife named Widad Babikar Omer, who had a number of children with her first husband Ibrahim Shamsuddin, a member of the Revolutionary Command Council for National Salvation who had died in a helicopter crash. Al-Bashir does not have any children of his own. In 1975, al-Bashir was sent to the United Arab Emirates as the Sudanese military attaché. When he returned home, al-Bashir was made a garrison commander. In 1981, al-Bashir returned to his paratroop background when he became the commander of an armored parachute brigade. The Sudanese Ministry of Defense website says that al-Bashir was in the Western Command from 1967 to 1969 and then the Airborne Forces from 1969 to 1987 until he was appointed commander of the 8th Infantry Brigade, independent, from the period 1987 to June 30, 1989. When he returned to Sudan as a colonel in the Sudanese army, al-Bashir led a group of army officers in ousting the unstable coalition government of Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi in a bloodless military coup on June 30, 1989. Under al-Bashir's leadership, the new military government suspended political parties and introduced an Islamic legal code on the national level. He then became chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council for National Salvation, a newly established body with legislative and executive powers for what was described as a transitional period, and assumed the posts of Chief of State, Prime Minister, Chief of the Armed Forces, and Minister of Defense. Subsequent to al-Bashir's promotion to the chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council for National Salvation, he allied himself with Hassan al-Turabi, the leader of the National Islamic Front, who, along with al-Bashir, began institutionalizing Sharia law in the northern part of Sudan. Further on, al-Bashir issued purges and executions of people whom he alleged to be coup leaders in the upper ranks of the army, the banning of associations, political parties, and independent newspapers, as well as the imprisonment of leading political figures and journalists. On October 16, 1993, al-Bashir increased his power when he appointed himself president of the country, after which he disbanded the Revolutionary Command Council for National Salvation and all other rival political parties. The executive and legislative powers of the council were later given to al-Bashir completely. In the early 1990s, al-Bashir's administration gave the green light to float a new currency called Sudanese dinar to replace the battered old Sudanese pound that had lost 90% of its worth during the turbulent 1980s. The currency was later changed back to pounds, but at a much higher rate. He was later elected president, with a 5-year term, in the 1996 national election, where he was the only candidate legally allowed to run for election. Omar al-Bashir was elected president, with a 5-year term, in the 1996 national election and Hassan al-Turabi was elected to a seat in the National Assembly where he served as Speaker of the National Assembly during the 1990s. In 1998, al-Bashir and the Presidential Committee put into effect a new constitution, allowing limited political associations in opposition to al-Bashir's National Congress Party and his supporters to be formed. On December 12, 1999, al-Bashir sent troops and tanks against Parliament and ousted Hassan al-Turabi, the Speaker of Parliament, in a palace coup. He was re-elected by popular vote for a 5-year term during the 2000 Sudanese general election. From 2005 to 2010, a transitional government was set up under a 2005 peace accord that ended the 21-year-long Second Sudanese Civil War and saw the formation of a power-sharing agreement between Salva Kiir's Sudan People's Liberation Movement, SPLM, and al-Bashir's National Congress Party, NCP. Al-Bashir was re-elected president in the 2010 Sudanese general election with 68% of the popular vote, while Salva Kiir was elected president of southern Sudan. These elections were agreed on earlier in the 2005 peace accord. The election was marked by corruption, intimidation, and inequality. European observers, from the European Union and the Carter Center, criticized the polls as not meeting international standards. Candidates opposed to the SPLM said they were often detained or stopped from campaigning. Sudan Democracy First, an umbrella organization in the north, put forward what it called strong evidence of rigging by al-Bashir's NCP. The Sudanese Network for Democracy and Elections, Shendi, spoke of harassment and intimidation in the south, by the security forces of the SPLM. When al-Bashir took power, the Second Sudanese Civil War had been ongoing for 9 years. The war soon effectively developed into a conflict between the Sudan People's Liberation Army and al-Bashir's government. The war resulted in millions of Southerners being displaced, starved, and deprived of education and health care, with almost 2 million casualties. Because of these actions, various international sanctions were placed on Sudan. International pressure intensified in 2001, however, and leaders from the United Nations called for al-Bashir to make efforts to end the conflict and allow humanitarian and international workers to deliver relief to the southern regions of Sudan. Much progress was made throughout 2003. The peace was consolidated with the official signing by both sides of the Nairobi Comprehensive Peace Agreement January 9, 2005, granting southern Sudan autonomy for 6 years, to be followed by a referendum on independence. It created a co-vice president position and allowed the North and South to split oil deposits equally, but also left both the North's and South's armies in place. John Garang, the South's peace agreement appointed co-vice president, died in a helicopter crash on August 1, 2005, 3 weeks after being sworn in. This resulted in riots, but the peace was eventually re-established and allowed the Southerners to vote in a referendum of independence at the end of the 6-year period. On July 9, 2011, following a referendum, the region of southern Sudan split off from Sudan to form South Sudan. Since 1968, Sudanese politicians had attempted to create separate factions of Africans and Arabs in the western area of Darfur, a difficult task as the population were substantially intermarried and could not be distinguished by skin tone. This internal political instability was aggravated by cross-border conflicts with Chad and Libya and the 1984–1985 Darfur famine. In 2003, the Justice and Equality Movement and the Sudanese Liberation Army, accusing the government of neglecting Darfur and oppressing non-Arabs in favor of Arabs, began an armed insurgency. Estimates vary of the number of deaths resulting from attacks on the non-Arab/Arabized population by the Janjaweed militia. The Sudanese government claimed that up to 10,000 have been killed in this conflict. The United Nations reported that about 300,000 had died as of 2010, and other reports place the figures at between 200,000 and 400,000. During an interview with David Frost for the Al Jazeera English program Frost Over the World in June 2008, al-Bashir insisted that no more than 10,000 had died in Darfur. The Sudanese government had been accused of suppressing information by jailing and killing witnesses since 2004, and tampering with evidence, such as covering up mass graves. The Sudanese government has also arrested and harassed journalists, thus limiting the extent of press coverage of the situation in Darfur. While the United States government has described the conflict as genocide, the UN has not recognized the conflict as such. The United States government stated in September 2004 that genocide has been committed in Darfur and that the government of Sudan and the Janjaweed bear responsibility and that genocide may still be occurring. On June 29, 2004, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell met with al-Bashir in Sudan and urged him to make peace with the rebels, end the crisis, and lift restrictions on the delivery of humanitarian aid to Darfur. Kofi Annan met with al-Bashir 3 days later and demanded that he disarm the Janjaweed. After fighting stopped in July and August, on August 31, 2006, the United Nations Security Council had approved Resolution 1706, which called for a new UN peacekeeping force consisting of 17,300 military personnel and 3,300 civilians and named the United Nations African Union Mission in Darfur, UNAMID. It was intended to have supplanted or supplemented a 7,000-troop African Union mission in Sudan peacekeeping force. Sudan strongly objected to the resolution and said that it would see the UN forces in the region as foreign invaders. A day after rejecting the UN forces into Sudan, the Sudanese military launched a major offensive in the region. In March 2007, the United Nations Human Rights Council accused Sudan's government of taking part in gross violations in Darfur and urged the international community to take urgent action to protect people in Darfur. A high-level technical consultation was held in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, on 11 to 12 June 2007, pursuant to the June 4, 2007 letters of the Secretary-General and the Chairperson of the African Union Commission, which were addressed to al-Bashir. The technical consultations were attended by delegations from the Government of Sudan, the African Union, and the United Nations. In 2009, General Martin Luther Agwai, head of the UNAMID, said the war was over in the region, although low-level disputes remained. Banditry, localized issues, people trying to resolve issues over water and land at a local level. But real war as such, I think we are over that, he said. This perspective is contradicted by reports which indicate that violence continues in Darfur while peace efforts have been stalled repeatedly. Violence between Sudan's military and rebel fighters has beset South Kordofan and Blue Nile states since disputed state elections in May 2011, an ongoing humanitarian crisis that has prompted international condemnation and U.S. congressional hearings. In 2012, tensions between Sudan and South Sudan reached a boiling point when the Sudanese military bombed territory in South Sudan, leading to hostilities over the disputed Haglaig, or Panthu, oil fields located along the Sudan-South Sudan border. Omar al-Bashir sought the assistance of numerous non-Western countries after the West, led by America, imposed sanctions against him. He said, "From the first day, our policy was clear, to look eastward, toward China, Malaysia, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, and even Korea and Japan, even if the Western influence upon some of these countries is strong. We believe that the Chinese expansion was natural because it filled the space left by Western governments, the United States, and international funding agencies. The success of the Sudanese experiment in dealing with China without political conditions or pressures encouraged other African countries to look toward China. Chadian President Idriss Deby visited Khartoum in 2010 and Chad kicked out the Darfuri rebels it had previously supported. Both Sudanese and Chadian sides together established a joint military border patrol. On October 26, 2011, al-Bashir said that Sudan gave military support to the Libyan rebels, who overthrew Muammar Gaddafi. In a speech broadcast live on state television, al-Bashir said the move was in response to Gaddafi's support for Sudanese rebels 3 years ago. Sudan and Libya have had a complicated and frequently antagonistic relationship for many years. President al-Bashir said the Justice and Equality Movement, JEM, a Darfuri rebel group, had attacked Khartoum 3 years ago using Libyan trucks, equipment, arms, ammunition, and money. He said God had given Sudan a chance to respond, by sending arms, ammunition, and humanitarian support to the Libyan revolutionaries. Our God, high and exalted, from above the seven skies, gave us the opportunity to reciprocate the visit, he said. The forces which entered Tripoli, part of their arms and capabilities, were 100% Sudanese, he told the crowd. His speech was well received by a large crowd in the eastern Sudanese town of Kassala. But the easy availability of weapons in Libya, and that country's poorly guarded border with Darfur, are also of great concern to the Sudanese authorities. Al-Bashir in his speech said that his government's priority was to end the armed rebellion and tribal conflicts in order to save blood and direct the energies of young people towards building Sudan instead of killing and destruction. He called upon youth of the rebel groups to lay down arms and join efforts to build the country. Al-Bashir sees himself as a man wronged and misunderstood. He takes full responsibility for the conflict in Darfur, he says, but says that his government did not start the fighting and has done everything in its power to end it. Al-Bashir had signed 2 peace agreements for Darfur. The 2006 Darfur Peace Agreement, also known as the Abuja Agreement, was signed on May 5, 2006 by the government of Sudan along with a faction of the SLA led by Mini Manawi. However, the agreement was rejected by 2 other, smaller groups, the Justice and Equality Movement, JEM, and a rival faction of the SLA led by Abdul Wahid al-Nur. The 2011 Darfur Peace Agreement, also known as the Doha Agreement, was signed in July 2011 between the government of Sudan and the Liberation and Justice Movement. This agreement established a compensation fund for victims of the Darfur conflict, allowed the President of Sudan to appoint a vice president from Darfur, and established a new Darfur Regional Authority to oversee the region until a referendum can determine its permanent status within the Republic of Sudan. The agreement also provided for power sharing at the national level. Movements that sign the agreement will be entitled to nominate 2 ministers and 2 foreign ministers of state at the federal level and will be able to nominate 20 members to the national legislature. The movements will be entitled to nominate 2 state governors in the Darfur region. On July 14, 2008, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, ICC, Luis Moreno Ocampo, alleged that al-Bashir bore individual criminal responsibility for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes that had been committed in Darfur since 2003. The prosecutor accused al-Bashir of having masterminded and implemented a plan to destroy the 3 main ethnic groups Fur, Masalit, and Zagawa with a campaign of murder, rape, and deportation. The arrest warrant is supported by NATO, the Genocide Intervention Network, and Amnesty International. An arrest warrant for al-Bashir was issued on March 4, 2009 by a pre-trial chamber composed of judges Akua Kanaihe of Ghana, Anita Yuzaka of Latvia, and Sylvia Steiner of Brazil, indicting him on 5 counts of crimes against humanity, murder, extermination, forcible transfer, torture and rape, and 2 counts of war crimes, pillaging and intentionally directing attacks against civilians. The court ruled that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute him for genocide. However, Yuzaka wrote a dissenting opinion arguing that there were reasonable grounds to believe that Omar al-Bashir has committed the crime of genocide. Sudan is not a state party to the Rome Statute establishing the ICC, and thus claims that it does not have to execute the warrant. However, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1593, 2005, referred Sudan to the ICC, which gives the court jurisdiction over international crimes committed in Sudan and obligates government of Sudan to cooperate with the ICC, and therefore the court, Amnesty International and others insist that Sudan must comply with the arrest warrant of the International Criminal Court. Amnesty International stated that al-Bashir must turn himself in to face the charges, and that the Sudanese authorities must detain him and turn him over to the ICC if he refuses. Al-Bashir was the first sitting head of state ever indicted by the ICC. However, the Arab League and the African Union condemned the warrant. Following the indictment, al-Bashir visited China, Djibouti, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Libya, Nigeria, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and several other countries, all of which refused to have him arrested. ICC member state Chad also refused to arrest al-Bashir during a state visit in July 2010. He was also invited to attend conferences in Denmark and Turkey. On November 28, 2011, following a visit to Kenya, Kenya's High Court Judge Nicholas Ombija ordered the Minister of Internal Security to arrest al-Bashir, should he set foot in Kenya in the future. In June 2015, while in South Africa for an African Union meeting, al-Bashir was prohibited from leaving that country while a court decided whether he should be handed over to the ICC for war crimes. He, nevertheless, was allowed to leave South Africa soon afterward. Luis Moreno Ocampo and Amnesty International claimed that al-Bashir's plane could be intercepted in international airspace. Sudan announced that the presidential plane would always be escorted by fighter jets of the Sudanese Air Force to prevent his arrest. In March 2009, just before al-Bashir's visit to Qatar, the Sudanese government was reportedly considering sending fighter jets to accompany his plane to Qatar, possibly in response to France expressing support for an operation to intercept his plane in international airspace, as France has military bases in Djibouti and the United Arab Emirates. The charges against al-Bashir have been criticized and ignored in Sudan and abroad, particularly in Africa and the Muslim world. Former President of the African Union Muammar al-Gaddafi characterized the indictment as a form of terrorism. He also believed that the warrant is an attempt by the West to recolonize their former colonies. Egypt said it was greatly disturbed by the ICC decision and called for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council to defer the arrest warrant. The Arab League Secretary-General Amr Moussa expressed that the organization emphasizes its solidarity with Sudan and condemned the warrant for undermining the unity and stability of Sudan. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation denounced the warrant as unwarranted and totally unacceptable. It argued that the warrant demonstrated selectivity and double standard applied in relation to issues of war crimes. Al-Bashir has rejected the charges, saying whoever has visited Darfur, met officials, and discovered their ethnicities and tribes, will know that all of these things are lies. He described the charges as not worth the ink they are written in. The warrant was to be delivered to the Sudanese government, which stated that they would not carry it out. The Sudanese government retaliated against the warrant by expelling a number of international aid agencies, including Oxfam and Mercy Corps. President Bashir described the aid agencies as thieves who take 99% of the budget for humanitarian work themselves, giving the people of Darfur 1% and as spies in the work of foreign regimes. Bashir promised that national agencies will provide aid to Darfur. Al-Bashir was one of the candidates in the 2010 Sudanese presidential election, the first democratic election with multiple political parties participating since the 1986 election. It had been suggested that by holding and winning illegitimate presidential elections in 2010, al-Bashir had hoped to evade the ICC's warrant for his arrest. On April 26, he was officially declared the winner after Sudan's Election Commission announced he had received 68% of the votes cast in the election. However, the New York Times noted the voting was marred by boycotts and reports of intimidation and widespread fraud. In August 2013, Bashir's plane was blocked from entering Saudi Arabian airspace when Bashir was attempting to attend the inauguration of Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, whose country is the main supplier of weapons to Sudan. A second arrest warrant for al-Bashir was issued on July 12, 2010. The ICC issued an additional warrant adding 3 counts of genocide for the ethnic cleansing of the Fur, Masalit, and Zaghawa tribes. The new warrant included the court's conclusion that there were reasonable grounds to suspect that al-Bashir acted with specific intent to destroy in part the Fur, Masalit, and Zaghawa ethnic groups in the Darfur region. The charges against al-Bashir, in 3 separate counts, include genocide by killing, genocide by causing serious bodily or mental harm, and genocide by deliberately inflicting on each target group conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction. The new warrant acted as a supplement to the first, whereby the charges initially brought against al-Bashir all remained in place, but now included the crime of genocide, which was initially ruled out, pending appeal. Al-Bashir said that Sudan is not a party to the ICC treaty and could not be expected to abide by its provisions just like the United States, China, and Russia. He said it is a political issue and double standards, because there are obvious crimes like Palestine, Iraq, and Afghanistan, but they did not find their way to the International Criminal Court. He added the same decision in which the Darfur case was being transferred to the court stated that the American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan would not be questioned by the court, so it is not about justice, it is a political issue. Al-Bashir accused Luis Moreno Ocampo, the ICC's chief prosecutor since 2003, of repeatedly lying in order to damage his reputation and standing. Al-Bashir said the behavior of the prosecutor of the court, it was clearly the behavior of a political activist, not a legal professional. He is now working on a big campaign to add more lies. He added, the biggest lie was when he said I have $9 billion in one of the British banks, and thank God, the British bank and the British finance minister denied these allegations. He also said, the clearest cases in the world such as Palestine and Iraq and Afghanistan, clear crimes to the whole humanity, all were not transferred to the court. Russia and China echoed Bashir's argument that the ICC was being used as a political tool and argued for al-Bashir's immunity as a head of state and continued supplying Sudan with weapons during the trial. As permanent members of the UNSC, they opposed the ICC's actions against al-Bashir and worked within the UNSC to block resolutions that would force al-Bashir to comply with the court's rulings. China had significant economic and strategic interests in Sudan, including oil investments, and maintained strong diplomatic ties with al-Bashir's government. They hosted him in 2015 despite the arrest warrants against him, and Russia as well in 2017, undermining the legitimacy of the court's ruling. In October 2013, several members of the African Union expressed anger at the ICC, calling it racist for failing to file charges against Western leaders or Western allies while prosecuting only African suspects so far. The African Union demanded that the ICC protect African heads of state from prosecution. On April 11, 2019, al-Bashir was removed from his post by the Sudanese armed forces after many months of protests and civil uprisings. He was immediately placed under house arrest pending the formation of a transitional council. At the time of his arrest, al-Bashir had been the longest-serving leader of Sudan since the country gained independence in 1956, and was the longest-ruling president of the Arab League. The army also ordered the arrest of all ministers in al-Bashir's cabinet, dissolved the national legislature and formed a transitional military council, led by his own first vice president and defense minister, Lieutenant General Ahmed Awad ibn Auf. On April 17, 2019, al-Bashir was moved from house arrest to Khartoum's Kobar prison. On May 13, 2019, prosecutors charged al-Bashir with inciting and participating in the killing of protesters. A trial for corruption, after $130 million was found in his home, and money laundering against al-Bashir started during the following months. On December 14, 2019, he was convicted for money laundering and corruption. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. On July 21, 2020, his trial regarding the coup that brought him to power started. About 20 military personnel were indicted for their roles in the coup. On December 20, 2022, al-Bashir said that he bears full responsibility for the events that took place in the country on June 30, 1989. The trial is expected to continue for several more months, and if convicted, Bashir could face a death sentence. On November 5, 2019, the Forces of Freedom and Change Alliance, FFC, which holds indirect political power during the 39-month Sudanese transition to democracy, stated that it had reached a consensus decision in favor of transferring al-Bashir to the ICC after the completion of his corruption and money laundering trial. In the following days, Sudanese transition period Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok and Sovereignty Council member Sadiq Talr stated that al-Bashir would be transferred to the ICC. On February 11, 2020, Sudan's ruling military council agreed to hand over the ousted al-Bashir to the ICC in The Hague to face charges of crimes against humanity in Darfur. In October 2020, ICC Chief Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda and a delegation arrived in Sudan to discuss with the government about Bashir's indictment. In a deal with Darfurian rebels, the government agreed to set up a special war crimes court that would include Bashir. On April 26, 2023, the Sudanese armed forces stated that al-Bashir, Bakri Hassan Saleh, Abdelrahim Mohamed Hussein and 2 other former officials were taken from Kobar prison to Alia military hospital in Omdurman due to the conflict that erupted earlier that month. Al-Bashir and other officials were later taken to a hospital at Wadi Saidna Air Base, where they remained until their transfer to a facility in Mero in September 2024. Al-Bashir is reported to be suffering from heart problems. Thank you for watching this video.